Back in August 2019, I made a video defending the much mangled Dalton era, a video which I stand by. Here I've decided to give my thoughts on the following Brosnan era and why I think it's just sort of okay. The Dalton era at the time did make certain sections of the audience uneasy at the evidently much darker and violent tone. While the 6-year hiatus had nothing to do with this, Eon was still keen to almost reset the Bond franchise. They didn't quite reboot it, at least not yet, but they certainly simplified things in terms of the tone. The Brosnan era doesn't shy away from darker themes, but these themes are far less present and more act as a sort of metaphorical window dressing, if you get what I mean. Brosnan's first Bond movie is an absolute blast, Goldeneye. How could it be anything other than a roaring success? It's well acted, expertly paced, has fantastic set pieces, and the plot is interesting and never drags. This was the film that the franchise needed after a 6-year hiatus. I don't hate the Brosnan era. In fact, Goldeneye is one of my absolute favourite Bond movies. Usually, after a period of time, people may reassess their thoughts on a film, and in this case, Goldeneye. However, Goldeneye is nearly 25 years old and is still regarded as one of the best ever Bond films, and Brosnan's best Bond film. Although, given the quality of his next Bond outings, perhaps that's not really saying much. 2 years after Goldeneye, Brosnan's second Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies, was released. Tomorrow Never Dies didn't open at number 1 at the box office due to opening against Titanic. Casual audiences will be hard-pressed to remember anything about Tomorrow Never Dies. It's not a bad movie. Elliot Carver, a parody of Rupert Murdoch as played by Jonathan Pryce, is fantastic, and the rest of the main cast, including obviously Pierce Brosnan, are brilliant. But there is something lacking with this movie. Of all of the official Eon Bond outings, this is possibly one of the most forgettable. In the eyes of many people, a forgettable movie is just as bad as a bad movie. You can remember, or worse, because at least those movies leave an impression. In 1999, The World Is Not Enough was released, and unlike Tomorrow Never Dies, actually has quite a bit going for it. Firstly, there's the magnificent opening pre-title sequence. At 14 minutes long, it is the longest pre-title sequence, but that doesn't inherently make it good. A lot of pre-title sequences follow some sort of narrative. Some of them are standalone mini-movies which have nothing to do with the main meat of the movie, whilst others are very much a part of the main movie, like Skyfall's pre-title sequence, for example. The World Is Not Enough often gets praised for its opening 14 minutes. Granted, there is a lot to praise in there, but the rest of the movie is pretty great too. Brosnan and the rest of the supporting MI6 regulars are as great as they always are. Nowadays, such a casting decision would be labelled as stunt casting, but Sophie McCory as Electra King, the first female villain, was brilliant. It totally shook up the Bond-villain dynamic and made the scenes more interesting. King isn't even one of the best Bond villains, but certainly stands out. Desmond Llewellyn is fantastic in his final on-screen appearance as Q. Having appeared in the Bond franchise since From Russia with Love, Llewellyn very quickly became as part of the franchise as the Aston Martin, the gun barrel, or Bond's iconic catchphrase. There's nothing outstanding about Llewellyn in this movie compared to his previous Q appearances, but as this was his final appearance, I thought I'd give it a little mention. Michael Apted, I'm probably mispronouncing that, made a brilliant choice for director, and the film is brilliantly shot. It may sound like I'm actively searching for things to praise this film for, but I'm not. These are genuinely great aspects of The World Is Not Enough. However, this film is just nowhere near as good as Goldeneye. It's never a great sign when out of 4 films, the best one by a mile is the first. And yes, that does mean that Die Another Day is not Brosnan's best. Shockingly, I know. To coincide with the 40th anniversary of the franchise, Eon released Die Another Day, which, to put it bluntly, is one of the worst Bond films ever made and weighs down the Brosnan era. Ignoring this outing for a moment, the Brosnan era was fairly good. Nothing exceptional bar Goldeneye, but still thoroughly entertaining action movies. Die Another Day does weigh down the otherwise moderately entertaining Brosnan era. It's a poorly directed outing, with the biggest issue being an overuse of CGI. CGI has never really been a part of Bond, at least not in the way it needs to be in Marvel's blockbusters. CGI just doesn't really have a place in the Bond franchise. Practical effects are the answer, and in this context make for a more immersive viewing experience. The hang glider sequence is a brilliant example of corny CGI. It looked bad in 2002 and looks even worse now. That's the problem with CGI. If overused, it can look atrocious as the years roll by. If you're gonna use CGI, only use it when it is needed. Die Another Day doesn't have a bad plot, it just rehashes elements from the classic Connery era and feels lacking in any originality. It also doesn't make sense for Bond to experience effectively 2 eerily similar villains twice in his lifetime, but that just sounds like a nitpick, so maybe it doesn't matter so much. much. The saving grace of Die Another Day is the chase sequence involving Bond's Aston Martin Vanquish and Zhao's Jaguar XKR. I always like the idea that the hero drives the Aston Martin while the villain drives the Jaguar. The chase sequence is genuinely good, but doesn't prevent the movie from being a waste of your time. At the time, it was assumed that Pierce Brosnan would appear in a 5th Bond movie. Brosnan's contract only ran for 4 films, though it was always possible there to be a 1-film extension. However, this didn't happen, and in February 2004, less than 2 years after Die Another Day was released, Brosnan announced his departure from the franchise. Brosnan's departure wasn't due to a stretched out legal challenge, unlike Dalton, but some were surprised to hear that Brosnan was leaving. However, the overall corny aesthetic of Die Another Day is one of the reasons why Eon wanted a gritty and more down-to-earth installment next, though Brosnan had nothing to do with this, to my knowledge at least. But by February 2004, the Brosnan era had come to an end, and while not exactly an abrupt end, it was disappointing that Brosnan's final film should be the ghastly mess that was Die Another Day. So, why do I think the Pierce Brosnan era is average? Goldeneye is, as has been repeated many times, is brilliant and stands as one of the best Bond outings. Tomorrow Never Dies is decent, but forgettable. Worse Bond films have come since this, but none of them are even slightly as forgettable. They're beautiful disasters, so much so that it's practically burned into my memory. Tomorrow Never Dies is just sort of okay. It's fine. Nothing is blatantly wrong with it, but it lacks that special, indescribable something. The World Is Not Enough is much better than Tomorrow Never Dies in every sense. It's even more memorable than a lot of Bond outings. In fact, if the Brosnan era was mostly as good as this, then perhaps I wouldn't be so quick to slap the average label on it. But Die Another Day is an awful movie. I don't care what anyone says. It's bad. Really bad. You can enjoy it on it's so bad it's good level, but is that really the bar to set for James Bond films? No, of course not. Die Another Day is poorly directed, too much CGI, is shoved carelessly onto the screen, and the plot rehashes aspects from classic Connery Bond films. And because of the averageness of Brosnan's 2nd film and the terribleness of his 4th, the Brosnan era is average. Overall, it doesn't add a ton to the franchise. I put emphasis on overall because Goldeneye in particular does add a ton to the franchise. The title of the video may also be a tad misleading, but it's perhaps the best one I could think of, and it works in the context of what I have said. But I don't think Brosnan as an actor was average. He was intense, witty, charismatic, and all of the other essential Bond elements in between. But his era was most definitely average, which is a shame, obviously. I am aware that the Brosnan era has its fans, so what is your favourite Brosnan Bond moment and why? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.